My parents sold everything to travel the world and came back demanding I support them. I gave them exactly the retirement they planned for. My parents called me from the airport, saying they were back from their 5-year world tour and would be staying with me. Not asking, telling. They'd sold our family home, cashed out their retirement accounts, and spent every penny traveling to 60 countries while constantly posting about living their best lives. When I was 23 and struggling to pay for college, they sold the house I grew up in and told me it was time I learned independence. They gave me 2 weeks to find somewhere to live and said experiencing hardship would make me stronger. They took the $400,000 from the house sale, plus their $300,000 in retirement savings, and bought one-way tickets to Thailand. They sent me postcards from beaches while I worked 3 jobs to afford tuition. They posted photos eating at 5-star restaurants while I survived on rice and beans. When I begged them for just a small loan to finish my last semester, they said they couldn't access their travel fund and that I needed to figure it out myself. They actually said that helping me would rob me of the satisfaction of earning my degree independently. I had to drop out with 1 semester left because I couldn't afford it. My parents were in Morocco riding camels that same week, posting about how life was too short to wait for adventure. For 5 years, they traveled everywhere: Europe, Asia, South America, Australia. They stayed in luxury resorts and took expensive tours. They bought designer clothes in Paris and jewelry in India. They never once asked how I was doing or offered to help when I got sick and had medical bills that destroyed my credit. They missed my wedding because they were at some meditation retreat in Bali that couldn't be rescheduled. They sent a card saying they were there in spirit while they posted photos of their couple's massage. Now they were standing in my apartment with 2 suitcases and nothing else. They announced they'd spent everything and needed to live with me while they figured out their next steps. My mother walked around my small apartment saying it would be tight, but they'd make it work. My father started moving my things out of my bedroom, saying they needed the bigger room for their bad backs from all the adventure sports they'd done. They told me I'd sleep on the couch since young people were more flexible. When I said absolutely not, they looked shocked. They said I had an obligation to care for them since they raised me. They actually brought up changing my diapers as a baby, like that was a debt I needed to repay. My mother said they'd given me life and 18 years of support, so I owed them at least that much back. They'd already told their travel friends that their successful daughter would be taking care of them. They'd bragged about how I had a good job and could easily support 3 people. What they didn't know was that I'd gotten that good job only after years of struggling because of them. They had no idea about the nights I went hungry, the times I was almost evicted, or the opportunities I lost because I couldn't afford to take unpaid internships like my peers. They sat on my couch, they were trying to claim as my new bed, and started talking about their expenses. They needed health insurance, spending money, food, entertainment, and a car since they'd sold theirs. They actually pulled out a budget they'd created showing I could afford to give them $3,000 a month if I cut back on unnecessary expenses like my gym membership and Netflix. My mother said I could also get a second job on weekends to help cover their costs. They were completely serious. For the next week, they refused to leave. They ate all my food, used my things, and invited their friends over to see their new home. They told everyone I was happy to support them after their adventures. They started looking at furniture to replace mine and talking about renovations I'd pay for to make the space more comfortable for them. They applied for credit cards using my address and had packages delivered daily from online shopping. When the bills came, they handed them to me, saying it was part of supporting them. That's when I executed my plan. I told them I'd been laid off and couldn't afford the apartment anymore. I said we'd all have to move somewhere cheaper. They panicked and asked where. I showed them listings for rooms in shared houses in the worst part of town, places with no privacy, shared bathrooms, and strict rules about guests and noise. They said absolutely not, but I said it was all we could afford now that I had no job. I'd already given my landlord notice that I was leaving, but hadn't told them that. I started packing everything and putting it in storage, telling them we couldn't afford to keep furniture. They watched in horror as their dream of a comfortable retirement disappeared. My mother's face went white, and she actually grabbed the edge of the couch to steady herself. I kept wrapping my books in newspaper and placing them in boxes, not looking up at her. She started making these little gasping sounds like she couldn't breathe right, and my father rushed over to her side. He kept asking what was wrong, what was happening, and she just pointed at the boxes with a shaking hand. I taped up another box and labeled it in thick black marker. My father finally understood and his mouth fell open. He asked if I was really serious about this, about making them live in some dump with strangers. I told him it was all we could afford on unemployment benefits while I looked for a new job. My mother started crying for real then, not the fake tears she'd used before. She said there was no way she could share a bathroom with random people, that she needed her privacy, that they were too old for this kind of living situation. I just shrugged and said I was sorry, but this was reality now. I pulled another stack of books off the shelf and started wrapping them. My father tried a different approach. He pulled me into the kitchen away from my mother and lowered his voice. He suggested maybe they could stay with some of their travel friends for a few weeks, just temporarily while I figured out my job situation and got back on my feet. His voice had this hopeful tone like he'd just solved all our problems. I reached into my pocket and pulled out his phone, which he'd left on the counter earlier. I handed it to him and told him to start making calls. I said I'd keep packing while he worked on finding them a place to stay. He took the phone slowly and stared at it like he'd never seen it before. I went back to the living room and started taking down pictures from the walls. Over the next 2 days, I watched my parents make call after call to every person they'd traveled with. My father would dial a number, put on this cheerful voice, and start talking about their adventures together. Then he'd casually mention they were back in town and looking for a place to crash for a bit. Every single time, I could hear the excuses through the phone, even from across the room. One friend was renovating their guest room. Another had family coming to visit. Someone else had just adopted a dog that didn't do well with strangers. My mother tried calling people too, using her sweet voice and laughing about old memories. She'd mention needing a favor, and I'd watch her face fall as the person on the other end found a reason to say no. By the second day, they'd gone through their entire contact list. They sat on the couch surrounded by my half-packed belongings and just stared at their phones. My father kept scrolling through his contacts like maybe he'd missed someone, some magical friend who would save them. My mother started crying again and said she couldn't believe their friends were abandoning them in their time of need. I was in the kitchen wrapping dishes and I almost laughed. I pointed out that these people weren't really their friends. They were travel buddies. They'd shared expensive dinners and tours, not actual lives. Now that my parents had no money and needed real help, everyone disappeared. My mother got this shocked look on her face like this possibility had never occurred to her. The next morning, my mother cornered me while I was packing up the kitchen. She stood in the doorway blocking my way out and started talking in this shaky voice. She said she gave birth to me, that she carried me for 9 months and went through labor. She said she changed my diapers and stayed up with me when I was sick and drove me to the school every day. She said she gave up her body, her time, her freedom to raise me. Her voice got louder as she talked and tears were running down her face. She said I owed her this help, that it was my turn to take care of her after everything she'd done for me. I put down the box of plates I was holding and looked at her. I started listing dates. I told her about the time I called from the hospital with a kidney infection, and she was in Barcelona and said she couldn't help. I mentioned when I got evicted from my first apartment and she was in Thailand posting pictures of beaches. I brought up my wedding that she missed for a spa retreat. I reminded her about begging for help with my last semester of college and her telling me to figure it out myself while she was buying designer clothes in Paris. I kept going, pulling up memory after memory, watching her face change. The manipulative sadness melted away and turned into genuine shock. She actually stepped back from me. She said she didn't realize I'd been keeping track of all that. I told her I remembered every single time I needed her, and she chose herself instead. Alexia showed up that afternoon to help me pack. I told her what was happening, and she came over with boxes and packing tape. My parents were sitting in the living room looking miserable when she walked in. She took one look at them and then at me, and I saw her jaw tighten. She started helping me wrap glasses and asked in this really loud voice if these were the parents who ate at fancy restaurants while I was in the emergency room with no insurance. My parents' heads snapped up and my father started to say something, but Alexia kept talking. She asked if they were the ones who spent $700,000 on themselves and then showed up expecting me to support them. My mother got this offended look on her face and said that wasn't fair, that they'd worked hard their whole lives and deserved to enjoy their retirement. Alexia laughed and said retirement usually meant you saved money, not spent every penny, and then demanded your kid take care of you. My father stood up and told Alexia she didn't understand, that family was supposed to help each other. Alexia looked at him and asked where that family help was when I was working 3 jobs to pay for college. My parents just sat back down and didn't say anything else. My father lost it that evening. He started yelling about how ungrateful I was, how he and my mother had sacrificed everything to raise me. He said they gave up their youth and their freedom and their dreams to take care of me. He said they'd earned the right to enjoy their retirement, and I was being selfish and cruel. His face was red and he was pacing around the living room waving his arms. He went on and on about everything they'd done for me and how I owed them. I let him finish his whole speech. Then I pulled out my phone and opened their Instagram account. I started reading their posts out loud. I read the one about living free from obligations and choosing adventure over responsibility. I read the caption about how they'd decided to stop letting other people's problems weigh them down. I read the post where they said life was too short to sacrifice for anyone else. My father's face went from red to pale. He tried to grab my phone, but I stepped back and kept reading. I found the post from when I was begging for help with college where they wrote about how freeing it was to cut loose from family drama. I watched him deflate like someone had let all the air out of him. His own words were right there proving everything I'd said. That night, Marcel came home from work and found my parents still camped out in the living room. I was surrounded by boxes and packing materials. He looked at the scene and then at me, and I saw him understand immediately what was happening. He didn't even hesitate. He told my parents we were moving to a tiny studio apartment because I'd lost my job and we could barely afford rent. He said they'd need to make their own arrangements because we wouldn't have room for them. His voice was calm but firm. My parents just stared at him. My father started to argue, but Marcel cut him off and said this wasn't up for discussion. We were moving in 3 days and they needed to figure out their own situation. My mother turned to Marcel with this pleading look. She said maybe he could pick up a second job to help out, that we were all family now. She said if everyone pitched in, we could make it work. Marcel looked at her like she'd just said the craziest thing he'd ever heard. He told her he'd never met anyone with more nerve in his entire life. Then he asked her how many job applications she'd filled out since she got here. My mother's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Marcel said that's what he thought and walked into the bedroom. My parents sat there in stunned silence. The next morning, I told my parents to get dressed because we were going to look at the shared housing option. My mother said she didn't feel well, but I told her this wasn't optional. We drove across town to a rundown house in a neighborhood they'd never been to. The landlord met us at the door and showed us the available room. It was tiny, barely big enough for a bed and a dresser. There were 5 other people living in the house, and they'd all been standing in the kitchen when we walked in. The landlord showed us the bathroom schedule posted on the wall with everyone's assigned times. My mother made this gagging sound when she saw the state of the bathroom. The toilet was stained and the shower had mold in the corners. The kitchen was worse, with dirty dishes piled in the sink and mystery stains on the counters. My father kept asking if this was really necessary, if we couldn't find something better. He sounded like he thought I was playing some kind of joke on them. I told him this was the only place in our price range that had immediate availability. The landlord started explaining the house rules about quiet hours and no guests after 9 p.m. My mother looked like she might throw up. I made my parents sit down at the grimy kitchen table in that house. I looked both of them in the eye and said yes, this was really happening. I told them this was their reality now because they'd chosen to spend $700,000 on themselves instead of keeping any kind of safety net. I said they could have traveled and still saved money, but they chose to spend every single penny on luxury. I reminded them they didn't just run out of money by accident. They made a choice every single day to spend more. I told them I'd help them fill out the application for this room if they wanted it. I'd even help them move their suitcases in. But I wouldn't be giving them money, and I definitely wouldn't be living with them. My mother started crying again and my father's hands were shaking. The landlord was standing in the doorway looking uncomfortable. I pulled out the rental application and set it on the table in front of them. I asked if they wanted me to help them fill it out, or if they'd rather be homeless. My father picked up the pen with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling. I watched my father's hand shake as he filled out the rental application, his handwriting barely readable. The landlord took the form and said he'd run their background check and let us know within 48 hours. My mother sat frozen in the chair, staring at the water-stained ceiling like she couldn't believe this was her life now. We walked back to the car in complete silence. My father opened his mouth twice like he wanted to say something, but both times he just closed it again and kept walking. When we got to the parking lot, he finally stopped and turned to face me. He said if I really went through with this and left them here, they might end up on the street, and how was I going to feel about that? I looked him right in the eye. I told him I'd feel exactly the same way he felt when I was almost evicted twice while he was parasailing in Greece. I said I'd feel the same way he felt when I called him crying about medical bills, and he sent me a postcard from New Zealand instead. My mother made this wounded noise, but I kept talking. I asked him how he felt when he knew I was sleeping in my car between jobs because I couldn't afford rent. I asked him how he felt when he posted photos of his 5-star hotel room while I was eating ramen for the 3rd week straight. He didn't answer. I told him he was about to find out exactly how that felt. Then I turned around and walked to my car without looking back. I sat in the driver's seat and waited. 5 minutes later, they both got in without saying a word. I drove them back to my apartment and told them I had to go. My mother asked where I was going. I said that wasn't her concern anymore. I grabbed the overnight bag I'd already packed and left them sitting on my couch surrounded by half-empty boxes. I drove to Marcel's place and he opened the door before I even knocked. He'd been expecting me. He pulled me inside and I finally let myself relax for the first time in days. He already had the guest room set up for me even though I'd be staying in his room. He said the guest room was just in case my parents somehow found his address. Over the next week, I went to my apartment twice a day to pack more things. Each time I showed up, my parents were still there, sitting among fewer and fewer pieces of furniture. They kept asking when I was going to tell them this was all a joke. My mother said I'd made my point and could stop now. My father said they'd learned their lesson about asking for too much. I just kept packing. I hired movers to take everything to the storage unit I'd rented across town. My parents watched the couch disappear. They watched the TV get loaded onto the truck. They watched my bed frame get carried out in pieces. My mother started crying when the movers took the kitchen table. She asked where they were supposed to eat. I handed her paper plates and said the floor worked fine. My father tried a different approach. He said he knew I was angry, but this was going too far. He said they'd be willing to get jobs if I just let them stay. I told him that ship had sailed when they handed me credit card bills, and told me supporting them was my obligation. The apartment got emptier each day. My parents had nowhere to sit except the floor. They had no TV to watch. They ate takeout on paper plates because I'd packed all the dishes. My mother called me every single night. She said they were trying to figure things out but needed more time. She said the shared housing hadn't called them back yet. She said they'd applied to 3 different assistance programs, but everything took so long. I told her that's how the system worked when you had nothing. I told her welcome to the life I'd lived for 5 years while they posted vacation photos. She hung up on me. 2 days before my lease ended, a woman named Caroline from social services called me. She said my parents had finally submitted their application for assistance, and she needed to verify some information. She asked if it was true they'd spent over $700,000 traveling. I said yes. She asked if it was true they'd refused to help me with college or medical bills during that time. I said yes. She asked if I'd offered to let them live with me. I said absolutely not. I explained everything. I told her about the house sale and the 2 weeks' notice. I told her about dropping out of college. I told her about the medical bills and the credit damage. I told her about my wedding they missed for a spa retreat. I told her about them showing up with suitcases and a budget demanding $3,000 a month. Caroline was quiet for a long moment. Then she said in 20 years of social work, she'd never seen such a clear case of people creating their own crisis through pure selfishness. She said my parents would qualify for minimal assistance because they had zero assets and zero income. She said they'd also be required to actively look for work and provide proof of their job search every week. She thanked me for my honesty and hung up. 3 days later, my mother called me crying. She said they'd been approved for assistance, but the amount was barely anything. She said they'd have to use food stamps. She said the caseworker told them they needed to apply for at least 15 jobs per week. She said it was humiliating to be doing this at their age. I asked her if it was more humiliating than begging your parents for help while they ignored you from a beach in Thailand. She didn't answer. I told her she could have avoided all of this by keeping even 10% of her retirement savings. I told her $700,000 could have lasted them 20 years if they'd been smart about it. I told her they chose to spend every penny on themselves, and now they got to live with that choice. She started screaming at me. She said I was a horrible daughter. She said they'd given me everything and I owed them. I hung up. The last day of my lease arrived. Alexia showed up at 8 in the morning with coffee in her truck. She looked around at the completely empty apartment and whistled. She said she couldn't believe I'd actually done it. My parents were sitting on the floor in the corner with their 2 suitcases. They looked terrible. My mother's hair was greasy and my father had dark circles under his eyes. They'd been sleeping on the floor for 3 days with nothing but the clothes in their suitcases. The apartment manager came by to do the final walkthrough. She looked at my parents sitting on the floor and asked if they were moving out too. I said they weren't on the lease. The manager's face got hard. She told my parents they needed to leave within the hour or she'd call the police for trespassing. My mother started crying again. My father stood up and asked me one more time if I was really going to do this. I looked at both of them. I said yes. Alexia and I did a final sweep of the apartment while my parents sat there in shock. We found a few things I'd missed and loaded them into her truck. The apartment manager came back at exactly 1 hour and told my parents it was time to go. My father picked up both suitcases. My mother could barely stand up. They walked out of my apartment and I watched them get into a taxi. The driver asked where they were going. My father gave him the address of a cheap motel on the east side of town. I'd looked it up earlier. It was $45 a night and took cash. They'd be using their assistance money to pay for it while they waited to hear back about the shared housing. I handed my keys to the apartment manager. She shook my hand and said she hoped things worked out for me. Alexia drove me back to Marcel's place. I looked out the window and watched my old neighborhood disappear. My phone rang an hour later. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered and a woman introduced herself as Patricia, one of my parents' travel friends. She said my mother had given her my number. She said she was calling because she was worried about my parents. She asked if I could reconsider helping them because they were family. I asked her if she was offering to let them stay with her instead. There was a long pause. She said her house was too small. I asked if she'd be willing to give them some money to help with expenses. She said she was on a fixed income herself. I asked her why she thought I should sacrifice when she wouldn't. She said it was different because I was their daughter. I told her that actually made it worse, not better. I told her my parents had spent 5 years ignoring me while I struggled, and now everyone expected me to fix their mess. I asked her again if she'd let them stay with her. She said she just wanted to check in and see how everyone was doing. I said that's what I thought. I told her if she really cared, she'd offer actual help instead of calling to guilt me into doing what she wouldn't do herself. She said I was being unreasonable. I hung up. The calls kept coming. 2 more of their travel friends contacted me over the next week. Each conversation went the same way. They all thought I should help. None of them would offer to help themselves. One of them actually said it was my duty as a daughter. I asked her where that duty was when my parents left me homeless at 23. She didn't have an answer for that. Marcel came home from work one evening and found me staring at my phone. He asked if my parents were still calling. I said no, but their friends were. He sat down next to me and asked how I was holding up. I told him the truth. I said part of me felt guilty, but most of me felt free. I said I'd spent 5 years thinking I was the problem, that I wasn't strong enough or smart enough to make it on my own. I said now I knew the problem was never me. It was them choosing to abandon me and then acting like I owed them something for it. Marcel put his arm around me. He said I'd done the right thing. 3 weeks after my parents first showed up at the airport, my father appeared at Marcel's apartment door. I was home alone. I looked through the peephole and saw him standing there by himself. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. He asked if we could talk. I asked where my mother was. He said she was at the motel, that he wanted to talk to me alone. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. We stood in the hallway. My father looked awful. He'd lost weight and his clothes were wrinkled. He said they'd made mistakes. He said they should have handled things differently when I was younger. He said they didn't think I'd actually abandon them. I cut him off. I told him I wasn't abandoning them. I told him I was refusing to fund a retirement they didn't plan for after they abandoned me first. He said it wasn't the same thing. I asked him how it was different. He said they were my parents. I said, and I was their daughter. But that didn't stop them from selling the house and leaving me with 2 weeks to find somewhere to live. He didn't have an answer. I asked him if he remembered the night I called him from the hospital. I asked him if he remembered me begging for help with the bills. He looked at the floor. I asked him if he remembered what he said. He said they couldn't access their travel fund. I told him that was a lie. I told him they could have helped, but they chose not to. I told him now he knew how that felt. My father's hands were shaking. He said they were in their 60s and had nothing. I said I was 23 and had nothing, but I figured it out. I told him it was his turn. He asked how long I was going to punish them. I told him I wasn't punishing them. I was just not rescuing them from their own choices. There was a difference. He stood there for another minute, then turned and walked away. I went back inside and locked the door. Marcel came home an hour later and I told him what happened. He asked if I was okay. I said I was better than okay. 2 weeks after my parents first arrived, I texted them both. I said I wanted to meet at a coffee shop downtown. My mother texted back immediately asking why. I said we needed to talk. My father said they'd be there. I got to the coffee shop first and picked a table in the back corner. I ordered coffee and waited. My parents walked in 10 minutes later. They looked even worse than when my father had shown up at Marcel's place. My mother's clothes were hanging off her, and my father had a defeated look in his eyes. They sat down across from me. Neither of them ordered anything. I took a sip of my coffee and looked at both of them. Then I told them the truth. I said I never lost my job. I said I made good money, more than enough to support 3 people if I wanted to. I said I could have let them stay with me and paid all their expenses without any financial strain. The look on their faces was exactly what I expected. My mother's mouth fell open. My father's face went red. I kept talking before they could interrupt. I said I needed them to feel the same panic I felt when I was almost evicted. I needed them to feel the same helplessness I felt when I had medical bills I couldn't pay. I needed them to understand what it was like to desperately need help and have someone who could help choose not to. My mother found her voice first. She started screaming right there in the coffee shop. She said I was a manipulative liar. She said I was cruel. She said how dare I put them through this when I had money the whole time. Other people in the coffee shop turned to stare. I waited for her to finish. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, I spoke quietly. I said now she knew exactly how it felt to desperately need help from someone who had the resources but chose not to give them. I said that was the lesson I wanted them to learn. My father's face had gone from red to pale. He said I'd tricked them. He said I'd let them suffer for no reason. I said no, there was a reason. The reason was they needed to understand what they'd done to me. They needed to feel it instead of just hearing about it. My father stood up so fast his chair fell over. He said he was going to tell everyone what I'd done. He said he'd ruin my reputation by exposing how I'd manipulated them and let them suffer. I pulled out my phone. I opened Instagram and pulled up their travel account. I turned the screen so they could both see it. I said I'd be happy to post the whole story myself. I said I'd include screenshots of their posts about living free from obligations. I'd include the budget where they demanded $3,000 a month. I'd include everything. My father sat back down. He didn't say another word. I finished my coffee while they sat there in silence. Then I stood up and walked out, leaving them at that table with the truth sitting between them like a bomb that had finally gone off. I waited 3 days before calling them. My mother answered on the first ring. I told her we needed to talk and gave her the address of a restaurant near their motel. She asked if I was finally coming to my senses. I hung up without answering. They showed up 20 minutes early and sat at the table looking nervous. I ordered coffee and let them wait in silence for 5 minutes before speaking. I said I had one offer and they could take it or leave it. I'd help them get into a modest 1-bedroom apartment and cover the first month's rent and deposit. They both had to get jobs within 30 days and keep those jobs. I'd help with groceries for 3 months, but after that, they were completely on their own. If they ever showed up demanding more or tried to guilt me into anything, I'd cut them off entirely, and they'd never hear from me again. My father started talking before I finished. He said a 1-bedroom wasn't enough space and 3 months of grocery help wasn't sufficient. He said they needed at least 6 months of full support to get properly established. My mother jumped in saying they'd need help with utilities and transportation costs too. I put my coffee cup down and looked at both of them. I said this was the only offer they'd get and I wasn't negotiating. They could accept it right now or I'd walk out and they'd be figuring out the shared housing situation on their own. My father said I was being unreasonable. He said they were my parents and deserved better treatment. I reminded him about the postcards from beaches while I worked 3 jobs. I reminded him about the 5-star restaurant photos while I ate rice and beans. I reminded him about the meditation retreat in Bali that was more important than my wedding. He went quiet. My mother tried a different approach. She said they'd accept my offer but needed help with the security deposit plus the first and last month's rent. I said first month only, take it or leave it. She said that wasn't fair. I said fair was spending $700,000 on yourself while your daughter nearly became homeless. She pressed her lips together and didn't respond. For 2 hours they tried every angle. They suggested I cover utilities for 6 months. They asked for a car. They wanted me to co-sign a credit card. They proposed I give them a monthly allowance for entertainment and personal expenses. Every single request got the same answer. No. This was the offer. Take it now or watch me leave. My father finally asked what kind of apartment I was talking about. I pulled out my phone and showed them 3 listings. All were in safe neighborhoods, but nothing special. Basic buildings with basic amenities. No pools or fitness centers or fancy lobbies. Just regular apartments where regular people lived. My mother looked at the photos like I'd shown her prison cells. She asked if there were any nicer options in better areas. I said these were the options, and my offer covered what I'd already shown them. My father asked about the furniture situation. I said I'd help them get basic furniture from discount stores. Nothing fancy but functional. Beds, a couch, a table, chairs. The essentials. He said they'd need more than essentials after the life they'd been living. I reminded him that the life they'd been living was over because they'd spent everything. He didn't have a response to that. Finally, my mother asked what happened after 3 months when the grocery help ended. I said they'd be on their own completely. They'd need to budget and manage like every other adult. She said that seemed harsh. I said harsh was telling your daughter that helping her would rob her of satisfaction while you rode camels in Morocco. The fight went out of both of them after that. My father asked if this offer was really not negotiable. I said it wasn't. He looked at my mother. She looked back at him. They both knew they had no other options. My father said they'd accept. I made them both say it out loud. I made them confirm they understood the terms. I made them agree that if they asked for more, I'd cut contact entirely. They agreed to everything because the alternative was the shared housing with 5 roommates and a bathroom schedule. I found them an apartment in a neighborhood 30 minutes from downtown. The building was older, but well-maintained. The apartment had 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen, and a living room barely big enough for a couch and TV. The rent was $800 a month. I paid the first month and the deposit. I took them to a discount furniture store and bought them a bed, a couch, a kitchen table with 2 chairs and basic necessities. The total came to under $1,500. My mother cried in the furniture store. Not because she was grateful, but because she was looking at cheap furniture after years of luxury hotels. I ignored her tears. I connected them with 2 employment agencies and made them both register. Within a week, my mother had a receptionist job at a dental office. My father got hired at a retail store in the mall. Both of them hated their jobs immediately, but they showed up because they had no choice. I helped them set up their apartment and stock their kitchen. I made sure they had everything they actually needed. Then I left and told them I'd check in once a week for the first month. 3 months passed. My parents kept their jobs but barely spoke to me beyond short texts confirming they were still employed. My mother sent terse updates every Sunday. Still working. Rent paid. That was it. No attempts at conversation or reconciliation. Marcel and I started seriously looking at houses. We found one we loved and put in an offer. I also enrolled in online classes to finish my degree. The 1 semester I'd had to drop was finally getting completed 7 years later. I studied at night after work and on weekends. Marcel helped me stay focused when I wanted to quit. I didn't regret what I did to my parents. They needed to learn that actions have consequences. They needed to understand that you can't abandon someone for 5 years and then expect them to fund your retirement. I needed to prove to myself that I could stand up to them and set boundaries they couldn't cross. We'd probably never have a warm relationship again. My mother's texts were cold and my father never contacted me at all. But I had peace knowing I'd done what I needed to do. They couldn't destroy the life I'd built from nothing. They couldn't take advantage of me anymore. I'd survived their abandonment and come out stronger. Now they were surviving too, but on their own terms, facing the reality they'd created when they chose adventure over responsibility.